Dr. Kholodilin. I'm really grateful for you joining us in this conversation. I didn't know about your work, but then I was looking around for a scholar of rent control in Germany specifically, and I've seen you have a couple of papers that are really perfect for this kind of class. This comparison of regulations of rental markets. This is something that similar to some research I've done, not about rental markets, but about land use regulations. So I'm interested in talking about that later. First, I was hoping you could give us just a sense of kind of German housing policy generally, kind of how would you characterize in a kind of big picture sense housing policy in Germany?
Well, at least in Germany, it's considered to be a moderate policy, so it's not too strict and not too free.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, it was relatively soon deregulated in the 60s, and then again in the 70s. I think it had to do with the hyperinflation.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier they started to regulate it, but slowly.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on the, or at least it should be based on market prices. So until recently, we've used the second generation rent control, where you have more or less freely set initial rents, and then during the contract, the rents were to be updated based on some kind of purchasing power index. Well, it's not always so it's one of the possibilities to link the price increases, rent increases to the consumer price index.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some other opportunities open, but the initial rent is supposed to be set at the market level. And probably you've heard or read about this rental mirror system, or Mietspiegel. So
Mm-hmm.
the system, when certain cities, not all of them surely, compute a kind of market-like rental price
Mm-hmm.
on on several statistics. Typically, it's surveys. So they survey tenants, and based on the data over the last 4 years, they compute the interval rents for different types of premises, different types of dwellings, depending on the year of construction or on equipment, and so on and so forth. So that has been the system before 2015, and then in 2015, at the background of growing rents, because since 2010 the rents started to grow quite quickly. Before that, there was a kind of stagnation after reunification. So in the early 90s, many dwellings has been built, too many. So kind of slump followed, where very few buildings were constructed. I mean, housing, residential buildings.
Right.
And, this continued until 2010, when, on the other hand, the stock of housing came to a minimum. Well, it didn't reduce, but it grew very slowly. And on the other hand, there had been an inflow of migrants, especially from European Union, and then later from other countries. And this refugees wave or refugees crisis in 2015. But by 2015, there was already a crisis, housing crisis or housing shortage. So that was not the inflow of refugees was not a ground for introduction of this new legislation piece, which is the Mietpreisbremse or rental brake. And it so unlike the previous legislation that led the initial rent to be set more or less free, this new legislation restricted the initial rent to be no more than this typical rent plus 10%. And typical rent is the rent which is observed for comparable dwellings in the same neighborhood or in the same region.
Interesting.
And
I can
then,
imagine there's a lot of disagreement about how typical a given building is.
yeah. Plus, you don't have, you don't have enough information in many cases, because
Right.
some cities they have this Mietspiegel, this rental mirror, but there are few of them. And even in those cities, the quality of this rental mirror is not very good. So there are a lot of criticisms saying that it's not reflecting well neither the location nor quality of dwellings.
Right. And the calculation of this, the rental mirror is like a rental price index, and is the calculation done by municipal governments, or is there a central oversight of some sort?
Yeah, typically it's done by the government, but not, of course, by the government itself. They commit somebody,
Right.
they find some organization that does it, some private institution that does it for them. And well, I don't know for all cities, because I think there are several dozens of such mirrors, and they are different. But for Berlin, if I can also send you a link, it's a booklet of 20 or 30 pages where you can find a list of addresses. And so if you go to these addresses, then you can find the category of your location, and then there are tables where you can find, as a function of your location, of the size of the dwelling, year of construction, and some other characteristics, you can find an interval,
right,
between 2 and 2.5 euros per square meter in month. And there are several other characteristics which are not tabulated, but which can influence the price. So you can move somewhere in between this 2 and 2.5 euros until you find the rent which more or less corresponds to your dwelling. So it's like flooring can play a role, or if you have fitted kitchen or not, they can affect the end price.
Right. And so you said that in the 60s, before the 60s, there was strict vacancy control where new tenants' rents were the same as the old tenants, and then that was changed in the 60s?
Yeah, so the system already was established in, well, the very first law was issued in 1922 in Germany, for whole Germany.
Right,
but
right.
In Russia, for example, it was already in 1919. So immediately after the end of the World War I, they started to freeze rents.
Right.
And then there was a deregulation period in the 20s. And then in 1936, so when Hitler already came to power, they issued a new law that froze the rents. And in Germany, this law actually was in operation until 1990, 1989, more or less, in East Germany.
In East Germany, right.
Republic, yeah. But in West Germany, they in the early 60s, they started to liberalize. They said, look, it's a little bit like in the USA, because they said, okay, there are some crises, some districts where the vacancies are already high enough, so above 3%. And if it's the case, well, they were not using the vacancy rate, but something similar to it. So they were looking at the relation between supply and demand, and they said, if in certain district the supply is high enough, is big enough, then you can deregulate. And they called this white districts, so districts that can be liberalized. And gradually this led to almost complete deregulation. Only a couple of cities remained regulated, like West Berlin and probably Hamburg. But by the end of 60s, the almost whole country was free from these regulations.
Right. And then have you seen, so kind of some of the typical effects that people worry about when talking about rent control is limited production of new housing. Have you seen this happen in Germany?
You mean after the introduction of these new laws?
Well, or just in the last decades? Yeah.
Well, the truth is that there are not so many, or there haven't been so many research conducted for Germany. So when you look in the literature, you find typically either USA or Sweden. In Germany, they started to investigate this issue after 2015, so after the new regulation.
I see. And do you think and why do you think that is is it because the rent controls were not very strict?
Maybe due to this reason, maybe also due to the fact that no information was available. So it's only after this online advertisement portals emerged, lots of information became available. Because before that, there was a rent index as a part of CPI, of consumer price index, but you couldn't find microdata on rents for apartments, and you didn't have detailed geographical information on rent development.
Yeah, no, I mean, rental data on rents is always difficult to come by. Is there not a registry for landlords that have to sign up to report to the government how much they're charging for rent?
Astonishingly, Germany is considered, the Germans themselves, they call their country as Mieterland, which means a country of tenants. The statistical data are relatively poor.
Interesting.
There are no registries, and they only have registries for the owners of land or dwellings, but not for the landlord.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, that's actually become a topic of discussion in California politics, is creating a rent registry, just because there is a relatively large lack of information about rents.
Yeah. But in general, if you read discussions in many other countries, you find this, like in Spain, they want to, in Catalonia, they recently in September, I think, they introduced the law which is almost an exact copy of 2015 law in Germany.
Oh, really? Interesting.
They even use the same criteria. So in Germany, it's not the law that cover, it's the regulations do not cover the whole country, but they cover just municipalities where the housing market is thought to be dense. So there are 5 criteria which must be satisfied before this region can be, this municipality or part of municipality can be considered as such.
Right. And does the 2015 law covers new buildings as well? It doesn't matter how old the buildings are?
No, actually it's an exception. So in previous laws, there was a distinction between old housing and new housing, and the old housing was the one that was built before 1948. It was before.
Very old.
Yeah, and now after this 2015 law, there's a new distinction. So the housing is considered to be new if it's completed after October 2014.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that's accepted, these kind of dwellings, they are accepted from the regulation. So there's no rental break imposed on these dwellings.
Right. And was there pushback from companies that build housing on the new law when it was being discussed?
Yeah, sure. You mean critiques?
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. There was a lot, but typically it doesn't work, because in most cities the largest part of population are tenants. So in Berlin it's 85%. Munich probably 70%. So it's difficult to. I mean, of course they can criticize, but if you want to be elected, you as a politician will not be. You will be eager to listen those who have more weight in the electorate. And by the way, talking about this new And old housing, the same distinction is done in the new law which was issued in Berlin in February. I don't know if you heard about it. It's called Mietendeckel, which is typical, which is actually rent freeze. So in Berlin, they froze rents in February of this year, and again there is this distinction between old housing built before October 2014, which is subject to regulations, and the new housing, which is not regulated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting, in California, we have a similar system where there's a state law that distinguishes between housing built, like you can't regulate rents on houses built before 1995. And then in the discussions about newer versions of statewide rent stabilization, the idea was to have a rolling date so that it's, housing that's built before 15 years ago is considered old, but that date moves, as time progresses, which kind of makes sense to have this kind of moving date rather than revisiting the date every once in a while. I wonder, was that brought up in the German conversation?
This idea, I never heard this idea for Germany. So actually, it's the first time I hear about it, because typically in European countries it's some concrete date. So it's not it's not a moving date, but it's I don't know, 1918 or 1914, for example.
Right.
2014, but not. I heard about such regulations, but in the opposite direction. So in some countries they say the housing, the new housing will be exempt from regulations for the first 5 years or 10 years.
Right.
It's
That makes sense.
But it's not in Germany.
And then, so as I understand it, there's like a substantial kind of social housing kind of cooperative system of apartments in Germany. Is this are they all Baugruppen? I mean, I know about the Baugruppen idea. I wonder if all of this kind of social housing side of things is Baugruppen, or are there different kinds of collective ownership?
No, actually, you have to distinguish between cooperative housing, municipal housing, and social housing. These are, although they probably fulfill the same, in a sense, the same purpose, but they are not the same system. Social housing is relatively small. It's just 3%, according to different estimates. It has been much larger in the 60s, but the thing is that in Germany, the social housing has two important features. First of all, it's typically built by private. So, for example, if you typically, when they talk about this, they make examples of a pharmacy owner or of an architect who has enough money to build a house, and then he gets a subsidy from the government or cheap loan, cheap land, whatever, builds dwellings, and then rents them out as social dwellings. So that means for a lower rent for a certain period, for 20 or 30 years. And after this period, there's no subsidies anymore, and the rents can be upgraded to the market level. So that becomes a private market housing. That's one of the reasons why social housing disappeared so quickly. So it wasn't demolished. It simply stopped to be social. It became normal private system dwelling. The municipalities, they also have some housing stock, but it's tiny. It's even smaller than the social housing. And cooperatives, they are in principle something between condominiums and rental housing, because everybody can become a member of cooperative. So you just pay your share. You can do it also in installments, and then the cooperative sets the rent. And then if you want to move, you can sell the share to the cooperative. That's it. So, but it's not really a social housing. It doesn't have. It's not like a big big real estate firm that tries to maximize its profits. It's more social.
Hmm.
I mean, socially oriented, but it's not
Right.
really social housing.
And for those, there are as many shares as there are units in a building for each project, or
Yeah,
so
I
like
think so.
everybody that lives there own one share.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure because I didn't investigate it in full detail. I know, for
Mm-hmm.
example, a guy who worked in my department in my institute,
Mm-hmm.
and then he lived in a cooperative
Mm-hmm.
house like this, and then he moved and simply sold his share to the cooperative.
Right.
And you can also get, there are different dwellings. You can typically, these are multi-dwelling houses, multi-story
Right.
houses, and
Right.
they can assign you any dwelling. So you you are a co-owner, but you don't own an exact dwelling like in condominium. You just own a share in this cooperative, and it's the decision of the cooperative which dwelling you will live in.
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And then those are also regulated by the same rent control rules as typical private rental housing.
Well, there are exceptions. For example, social housing is not subject to these controls. It's subject to other controls, of course.
Right. Right.
But municipal housing, uh, it's a good question because at some points it was excluded from these regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I didn't. I mean, it doesn't appear to me. I cannot recollect any mention of cooperative housing in these laws, but I have to
Mm-hmm.
check because I didn't spend
That's fine.
really
Yeah.
too much attention to this detail.
Right. No, no worries. Great. I wanted to move on to ask you about some of your research, Aurora, unless you have any other questions about.
I do. I just have a couple if it's okay.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the rental price break and I ask a couple questions about that.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is how is it defined or decided? Because you mentioned that some municipalities participate in this and some don't. So I was wondering, like, what is the criteria or how is that decided whether they participate or not?
Yeah. Well, it's a issue that is decided by Länder. So in Germany is divided. It's like state. Germany is divided in 16 Länder. Among them, 3 city Länder like Berlin, Hamburg, and Bremen. And in principle, each of them, the decision about classifying municipality as subject to regulations or not is left by Länder, by these states. And what they typically did, because now I don't think they continue it, so they did it in the first 2 years. They hired some research institute in order to identify the regions which can be subject to such regulations. And in the law, you find 4 or 5 criteria, like, for example, how fast the rents are growing compared to the national average. Uh, I think, yeah. Also, probably the look at the. I can look at it in more detail because I have it here. Just a second. So I don't want to improvise. Good. 2015. Yeah. So local rents grow faster than at the national level. Local average rent to income ratio or rental burden is significantly higher than the national average. Population grows, whereas new housing construction does not create enough dwellings. So they look at the relation between supply and demand. Vacancy rate is small while demand is high. Yeah, for these 4 criteria. So rent growth, rent to income ratio, population and housing construction, and the 4th criterion is the vacancy rate.
Thank you for that.
Exactly the same, or almost the same criteria you find in the new Catalan law. And I think also in France, they also at least copied, at least in part, some of the provisions of German law.
But it's interesting that, because you said it's the growth in rents can only be CPI plus 10%.
No, it's different from
oh, this is the new rent when somebody moves out and a new person moves in. Then it's the market plus 10%.
No, it's the initial rent. So, for example, say
right.
you're dwelling, and the rent is 1,000 euros per month.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then you find a new tenant, and you must look at the typical rent, and that typical rent is 900 euros
right
per month. Then you have to add 10%, which is 990, and that's your rent. So you cannot rent it for 1,000 euros anymore. You can rent it only for 990, and then within the duration of the contract, you can. There are different, as I said, there are several systems how you can update your rent, but it's not like in the USA where you have like in Oregon, I think you have CPI plus 7%. That's the annual increase. In Germany, it's not like this. You cannot. Well, there's no strict constraint imposed on the rent increase, but during the contract duration. But as a rule, it shouldn't be far above the inflation rate. But you don't find specific provisions in the law saying that it must be CPI plus X percent or CPI plus 0%, whatever. So you have actually three different modalities. One is use a kind of index, but they don't say what kind of index it should be. But implicitly, it can be the CPI. You can also use a kind of stepwise increases in rent. There's no actually limitation on these stepwise increases, but again, implicitly, I think they shouldn't too much exceed the CPI. And you have also, what was another system? Well, I have to check it, but
and this is the landlord. Individual landlords are choosing which system to use, or is it by city or by region that
no,
they use?
It's landlords who choose the.
Ah, wow, interesting.
So they have different opportunities, and they can choose the one that they like.
Mm-hmm.
Are they required by law to disclose what they charged other tenants?
Now they have to do this because, especially in Berlin, after this new law came in power, they have to provide to the new tenant the information about the old rent, the previous.
Interesting. And are there rent boards that review kind of tenant, like if a tenant is complaining that the rent is going up too much, is there some kind of local court, or how would they address that issue?
No. 100 years ago, I would answer yes. They had the rental boards, but then they were abolished already in the 20s, and since then they didn't have any specific rental board. It's a normal court that decides whether the rent is fair or not, whether they evicted a tenant correctly or not.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And just one last question on this, or maybe not even on this, but in general. You mentioned Berlin kind of in February, putting these new kind of additional measures, like beyond what is at the national level. Are there any other cities that are doing this other than Berlin?
No, not yet, because they started to talk about this last year. And by the way, Paavo asked me about the reaction of landlords, and there was an appeal to landlords to raise their rents, because already in June 2019, Berlin's government said that the rents will be frozen at the June level, and so this landlord organization immediately made an appeal to their members to raise the rents so that the initial level would be higher.
Yeah, no, this happened in California too with some of the rent regulation stuff, where then landlords would say, oh, in case that in the future this city starts doing a rent freeze, like every landlord should be raising their rents now to get in. You know, it's a problem, unintended negative consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And so there was some discussion in the media, and I read that not Hamburg, but Bremen wanted to do something, but they actually said they will observe first before they decide. So in Bavaria, they also talked about this, but it was not much than just talking about it. So nobody is in a hurry to copy Berlin. They're just waiting until some results will come about the effectiveness of this system.
And then you also have studied the impacts of this 2015 law on new supply, or like the decisions of landlords to rent or sell. Is that true?
Yeah. So together with two colleagues of mine, we investigated different consequences of the law, both on rents and on equipment of housing. And so the one conclusion that we made was that, so we used this fact that the regulation was not applied to all housing, but just to the old housing, so housing completed before 2014. And that allowed us to analyze the trends in prices of dwellings that are located in the same place, but different. I mean, we took dwellings that are a little bit older than 2014, so built since I think 2008, 2010. So compared to dwellings that were completed after 2014, they are basically the same. So because the technology is the same, the standards are the same. But whereas the former category that is subject to the regulations, the second category, which are the dwellings built after 2014, is not. So this is called difference in difference analysis in econometrics. When you compare very similar groups with one exception, so there's only one feature where they're different, and that's feature is subject to regulations or not. And we found that the difference in rent increases was significant. So it means that either the rents for regulated dwellings grow slower, or that the rents for non-regulated dwellings grow faster. So it in fact it's a dual effect. So on the one hand, you have a certain slowdown for regulated dwellings, so the regulations is effective in a sense. So it's rental brake, so it braked the growth of, or slowed down the growth of rents. But on the other hand, you have a faster rent increase in case of new dwellings. It means that you have a kind of income redistribution. So the tenants who came later to the market, they have to rent new dwellings. They have to pay more. Because because of this effect of regulation. So you have an intended effect, but also an unintended effect.
And then did you find, I mean, that's something that has happened in California as well, where when there are stricter forms of rent regulation, then landlords often convert their apartments into condominiums and sell them rather than persisting as landlords. Was that also something you found?
Well, there's a new study that I'm doing together with other two colleagues,
Hmm.
and that's about Mietendeckel. So it's this new regulation of 2020 in Berlin, and there we look both at rental prices and at the structure of advertisements.
Mm.
And there we can also see that the structure changed a lot. So before the majority of advertisements were rental dwellings, now they are dwellings in condominiums, so dwellings for sale,
Right.
which is an indirect sign for possible changes in the structure of the market, in the property structure of the market. But in Berlin, well, in Germany in general, we have regulations that can prevent conversions.
I see.
So in some cases they I think it's even federal regulation. They say that, but it's not for the whole municipality. They can identify certain areas within the municipality where the conversions are only possible after a certain period, like 7 or 10 years. So you have to, it's a rental dwelling, but before you can convert it to a condominium, owner-occupied dwelling, 7 years must pass.
Right.
And that can be an effective limit on it's not, as I said, it's not the whole city, but at least parts of the city are subject to such limitations.
Right. Interesting. But I was going to ask kind of a shifting gears. I was curious whether you had a perspective on kind of the Soviet era housing policy. And I think one interesting way that people debate kind of policy design versus policy implementation. And some people might say that, well, the fact that there were problems with the implementation doesn't mean the design itself is bad. You understand what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't mean that, collectivized housing is necessarily bad just because in some cases you had kind of implementation problems. I wonder what kind of, do you have a perspective on the Soviet housing policy, or just because you're originally from Russia, as I understand?
Sure, because first of all, I'm from Russia, as you know probably, and I lived both in a shared apartment, which is a system created after the revolution. So at that time there was a shortage. Well, actually, in the beginning there was not shortage of housing because population of, for example, of St. Petersburg decreased 3 times. So from 2 million to 0.7 million due to civil war. But then after the situation normalized, there was a big inflow of industrial workers, and there were big problems with housing. So many families had to share the apartments. For example, my great grandfather, he lived in the same apartment. It was 7 rooms apartment, which belonged to the owner of the house, by the way. And they split it in. Actually, they didn't split it. They lived. Each family lived in a room or in 2 rooms. And this same situation is conserved until now. So there are probably not so many, maybe 100 or 200 families who live in such shared housing. Moreover, even privatization was conducted based on this room property. So it's not even apartment property like in condominiums. It's a room property. So you can be an owner of a room in an apartment.
Wow.
And that's, I think it's something peculiar for Russia or for the former Soviet republics. And then I also lived in a cooperative apartment, which my father bought. So there was also a possibility to buy an apartment. You paid, how do you call it, an initial sum, and then you had to pay a month kind of rent, but which at the same time was kind of well, it wasn't a debt. Well, it was a debt, but without interest. So you paid your rent, which at the same time was the payment in your
Right, like a mortgage.
Exactly.
Rent to own.
Yeah, and I actually profited from hyperinflation in the 90s
Sure,
because
yeah.
because there was no indexation at that time, and
Yeah,
the sums that were quite big in 80s became tiny, almost
right.
non-existent in the 90s.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a bit familiar with the system.
And then was there, I mean, I think one of the common critiques of like a strict regulation and rent control is like a big black market in housing. And is that something you've observed either in Germany or in?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say a few words about Russia, since we're already
Yeah.
in By the way, you see St. Petersburg.
Yeah, I was wondering if that's St. Petersburg. Yeah, it's cool.
That's, I don't know if you can see it. That's the place where I was born. I lived the first years of my
Right.
life. And there you had a system of swaps,
Mhm.
house swaps. So there's a nice book, unfortunately in Russian. I mean, unfortunately for you, which is about the whole system. So it was written by a guy who helped people to move in the Soviet times. In Soviet times, so at that time you could not really sell and buy apartments if it wasn't a cooperative apartment. So the only way which was open to you was to swap, and it's not as easy as it seems. So if you want some dwelling, or for example you live in a room, you could in principle swap it against a separate apartment in a different city or a different district of the same city. But it meant that you had to build a whole chain of other people and other apartments, rooms of different configuration, different sizes, and different located in different places before you could come to the apartment or rooms that you decide to obtain.
Right.
So if somebody in the last minute decided to break, then the whole chain collapsed.
Right.
And so the chains could be 10, 20, 30.
Wow.
Yeah, many units. So you had to be really very ingenious and yeah, had superhuman.
It's like a complex negotiation.
Yeah, and there were places where people gathered and they exchanged the information. So it was a kind of market, but yeah, in a sense, black market.
Right.
In Germany, they had similar system in eastern part, in the democratic part, and so they also had this. I don't know how well it was developed compared to the Soviet system, but in West Germany they had typical key money and furniture money, so something which is typical for other market countries
Right.
have controls.
And is that's legal in that was legal in West Germany, or was it not legal?
It wasn't. I mean, strictly speaking, it wasn't legal, but I think it wasn't prohibited in some.
Not enforced. Right.
Yeah, in some countries you find the provisions in laws that say no payments above rent are to be tolerated. Germany, I don't think if I found such provisions in the laws, but what can you say? What can you do if there's a housing shortage? I mean, of course you have regulations. That's one thing, but you also have a real life, which is another thing. And people try to arrange as they can.
Yep. And I mean, the other aspect I think that's very interesting on this topic is how often people move. And I have anecdotal stories of friends, especially from Holland, that my friend's sister, she got a great apartment in Amsterdam many years ago, and so even though she got a good job offer in another part of Europe, she's never going to move because her living condition her rent is too good, right? Have you observed this like in Germany? Is that a big problem? It doesn't sound like Germany's system is so strictly controlled that it's limiting people's movement.
Well, talking about social housing, because these stories, I also heard about such stories for England and for Amsterdam, about social housing and quite well-off people living in for a tiny rent. In Germany, they also have this entrance control in the social housing. So for example, when was it, 10 years ago, I was trying to find an apartment together with my wife, and we found a nice apartment, but we had to show a kind of document saying that we have not enough income, or so that our income is low enough to live in that apartment.
Right.
And unfortunately, my income was far too high for such a nice apartment. But as soon as you obtain such permit, you can move in, and then nobody can kick you off.
Right.
So there's no continuous means check for this kind of social housing.
That's similar to Hong Kong. Is a similar way where once you're in, you can make a lot of money, and then they never check.
Exactly. But you can see that there are several or quite a few of decrees that appeal or that C4 means checks for social housing, but they are never enforced. So it shows how unenforceable is the thing. So there are some regulations that say you have to check the eligibility of a person living in the social housing, but nobody does it, or maybe just at the little scale. Probably it's considered to be not so social. So kicking somebody out of dwelling is not very nice. By contrast, if it's housing allowance, so you can either live in a social housing, or you can get some certain sum of money from the government, like supplementary income, so that you can live in not in the dwelling you wish, but in some dwelling which satisfies your conditions. So there are several limits imposed on this dwelling, but in that case, you have to be checked every year. So as your income goes up high enough, that
you get less.
You get less, or you don't get this supplement anymore. But it's much easier to cut the supplement than to kick off somebody.
I mean, this is very similar to the U.S. housing voucher system that hopefully is going to get bigger in the new administration.